She went to bed as a bride and woke
Michael,
up
where
to a
are you?
nightmare she could never have imagined.
Are you there?
The silk sheets still carried the scent of roses from the ceremony, and champagne glasses sat half empty on the nightstand. Everything about that night had been perfect. The music had floated through the air like a dream, friends and family had laughed until their cheeks hurt, and the lights had twinkled like stars brought down to earth just for them. But somewhere, between the last dance and the first light of dawn, something had shifted. Sarah had felt it in the quiet moments when the guests had gone home, in the way Michael's hand had trembled slightly as he poured them wine, in how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes when he toasted to their future. She had blamed it on nerves, on the overwhelming emotion of the day, on the natural anxiety that comes with promising forever to another person. But when she reached across the bed at 3 in the morning, her fingers found only cold sheets. The bathroom door stood open, revealing darkness. His shoes were gone from beside the dresser, and on the pillow where his head should have rested, there was nothing but the faint impression of someone who had already decided to leave. Before we dive into the full story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Let's get started now. The apartment felt different in that pre-dawn silence. Sarah sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders, trying to make sense of the empty space beside her. Where was Michael? Why would he leave without a word on the night they had promised each other everything? She reached for her phone, but something made her pause, a feeling she couldn't name. Instead, she got up and walked to the living room. That's when she noticed it. The briefcase. His brown leather briefcase that he'd kept by the door all week, the one he'd been oddly protective of, was gone. Her heart began to pound as she moved toward her desk in the corner. The drawer where she kept her important documents stood slightly ajar. With trembling hands, she pulled it open. Her passport, her social security card, her work identification, the folder containing her professional certifications and licenses, all of it. Gone. On the desk, written on hotel stationery in Michael's neat handwriting, were 4 words that made her blood run cold. "I'll take care of it." What did that mean? Take care of what? And why did he need her entire identity to do it? 6 months earlier, Sarah Mitchell had been living the life she'd worked so hard to build. At 32, she was a senior consultant at a healthcare management firm in Chicago, a position she'd earned through countless late nights and sacrifices. Her apartment in Lincoln Park wasn't large, but it was hers. Every piece of furniture, every small decoration, represented a choice she'd made with money she'd earned. Her father had died when she was 19, leaving her mother to raise 3 kids on a teacher's salary. Sarah had been the oldest, the one who took on 2 jobs while finishing college, the one who sent money home even when her own account ran dangerously low. Independence wasn't just important to her, it was oxygen. Her best friend Monica often joked that Sarah kept her life organized like a hospital chart, everything labeled and in its proper place. And it was true. Her documents were filed meticulously. Her work credentials were backed up in multiple locations. She had systems for everything because growing up with so little had taught her that security came from preparation. That's why meeting Michael had felt like such a gift. He'd walked into her life at a medical conference in Boston, charming and attentive in a way that felt effortless. He worked in medical device sales, he'd said, traveling frequently but based in New York. He had stories that made her laugh, a way of listening that made her feel truly heard. Their long-distance relationship had unfolded over video calls and weekend visits, building slowly into something that felt solid and real. He'd been curious about her work, asking detailed questions about her projects and clients. She'd thought it was sweet, the way he wanted to understand every part of her life. When he'd asked about her professional licenses and certifications, saying he was impressed by how much she'd accomplished, she'd felt proud. When he'd mentioned wanting to understand her financial situation before they got serious, she'd appreciated his practical approach to their future. Red flags, she would later realize, don't always look red when you're looking through rose-colored glasses. The proposal had come 4 months into their relationship during a weekend in Michigan overlooking the lake. It had felt fast, but Michael had made such a compelling case. They weren't getting any younger. They both wanted the same things. Why waste time when they'd found something real? Sarah's mother had expressed concern about the timeline, but Sarah had defended her choice. She was an adult, capable of making her own decisions. She knew what she wanted. The wedding had been small, just immediate family and close friends, held at a boutique hotel in downtown Chicago. Monica had been her maid of honor, wearing a dress the color of champagne and a worried expression she tried to hide. The night before the wedding, Monica had asked if Sarah was absolutely sure. "It's just so fast," Monica had said carefully, painting Sarah's nails a soft pink. "I know you love him, but do you really know him?" Sarah had laughed it off. She knew enough. He made her happy. He saw a future with her. That was what mattered, wasn't it? The ceremony itself had been beautiful. Michael had cried when she walked down the aisle, and his vows had been everything she'd hoped for. Promises of partnership, of building a life together, of facing whatever came as a team. His parents had flown in from Arizona, warm and welcoming, telling Sarah how lucky Michael was to have found her. His sister had given a toast about how Michael had always been the responsible one, the brother who took care of things. "When Michael commits to something," she'd said, raising her glass, "he sees it through no matter what." At the time, it had sounded like a compliment. The reception had lasted until nearly midnight. There had been dancing and champagne, her uncle's terrible jokes, Monica's heartfelt speech that made everyone cry. When they'd finally returned to Sarah's apartment, which would now become their apartment, Michael had seemed distracted. He checked his phone several times, apologizing each time and blaming work. "I'm sorry," he'd said, pouring them each a glass of wine. "There's just this deal that's closing, and the timing is crazy." She'd understood, or she'd thought she did. They'd toasted to their marriage, to their future, to all the adventures ahead. His hand had shaken slightly, she remembered now, wine trembling in the glass. When she'd asked if he was okay, he'd smiled and said he was just overwhelmed with happiness. They'd gone to bed around 1 in the morning, both exhausted from the long day. Sarah had fallen asleep almost immediately, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Steady and strong, she'd thought, the heartbeat of the man she'd chosen to spend her life with. She had no idea that in a few hours, she'd wake up to find that man gone, along with every piece of identification that proved who she was. The first thing Sarah did was call his phone. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. His voice on the recording, warm and familiar, made her chest tighten. She tried again, and again. On the 5th attempt, the phone went straight to voicemail, as if he'd turned it off, or blocked her number. That's when the panic truly set in. She opened her laptop with shaking hands and logged into her email, scrolling frantically for any message from him. Nothing. She checked their shared calendar. Empty. She went to their text conversation, reading back through months of messages. "Can't wait to marry you. You're my forever person. I'm the luckiest man alive." How could someone write those words and then vanish? She checked the closet. His suitcase was gone. The toiletries he'd brought over the previous week had disappeared from the bathroom. It was as if he'd planned this, packed strategically, waiting for the moment when she'd be too exhausted and trusting to notice. The realization hit her like cold water. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a wedding night emergency that had pulled him away. This was deliberate, calculated. He had stolen her identity and run. Sarah's hands trembled as she called Monica. It was 4:30 in the morning, but Monica answered on the second ring, her voice alert with concern. "Sarah, what's wrong?" "He's gone," Sarah managed to say, her voice breaking. "Michael's gone, and he took everything. My passport, my social security card, all my work documents. Monica, what do I do?" Monica was at the apartment within 20 minutes, still wearing her pajamas under a coat. She found Sarah sitting on the floor of the bedroom, surrounded by the scattered contents of every drawer and cabinet, as if searching them again might somehow make the missing documents reappear. Together, they went through everything methodically. Michael had been thorough. He'd taken her birth certificate, her professional licenses, her banking information that she'd foolishly kept in a folder marked important documents. He'd even taken the spare key to her office. "We need to call the police," Monica said firmly. But Sarah shook her head. What would she tell them? That her husband of less than 24 hours had left with her documents? Would they even take it seriously? They were married now. Legally, didn't that complicate things? And what if she was wrong? What if there was some explanation? But as the sun rose and the hours passed with no word from Michael, the truth became impossible to deny. Sarah began to remember things she'd ignored before. The way he'd been vague about his company, never quite explaining which medical device firm he worked for. How he'd always suggested they meet at her place rather than his apartment in New York, claiming it was under renovation. The time she'd tried to friend his sister on social media and found the account had been deactivated. The way his parents had seemed oddly formal at the wedding, as if they were playing roles rather than celebrating their son's marriage. She pulled up their wedding photos on her phone, zooming in on his face. That smile she'd thought was nervous excitement. Now it looked like something else. Guilt, calculation, the face of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. By noon, Sarah had started making calls, first to her bank to put alerts on her accounts, then to her credit card companies, to her employer's HR department, trying to explain why she needed to report her work credentials as stolen without revealing the humiliating details. Each conversation required her to say it out loud. My husband took my documents. No, I don't know where he is. Yes, we just got married yesterday. The sympathy in people's voices was almost worse than the situation itself. If you're still watching, drop a comment with, "I'm still here," so we know who's writing this case out with us. Monica stayed with her all day, ordering food that Sarah couldn't eat, making calls on her behalf, holding her hand when the reality of it all became too much. "We need to file a police report," Monica insisted again in the afternoon. This time Sarah agreed. The police officer who took her statement was professional but skeptical. Couples fought. People did impulsive things after weddings. Was she sure this wasn't just cold feet manifesting in an unusual way? Had she tried contacting his family? Sarah explained that his phone was off, his email wasn't bouncing back, but wasn't being answered, and his parents' number went to a disconnected line. The officer's expression shifted then, from skepticism to concern. He took down all the information she could provide. Michael's full name, Michael James Porter, his supposed place of employment, his physical description, the few details she actually knew about him, which suddenly seemed pathetically sparse. How had she married someone she knew so little about? The officer promised to investigate but warned her that these cases were complicated. If Michael had her documents, he could potentially use them for identity theft, open accounts in her name, even commit crimes using her identity. Sarah felt sick. This was worse than abandonment. This was devastation. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her apartment after Monica reluctantly left for work obligations. The wedding gifts were still stacked in the corner, unopened. The flowers from the ceremony were beginning to wilt. She walked through the rooms, seeing them differently now. The bed where she'd slept beside a stranger, the desk where he'd stolen her entire identity, the kitchen where he'd poured her wine and lied to her face. She picked up her phone and scrolled through their photos together. Boston, where they'd met. New York, where she'd visited him. Or had she? Now she couldn't remember the address of the apartment he'd claimed was his. She'd always met him at restaurants or hotels. He'd always had an excuse. In every photo, he was smiling. In every photo, he looked like someone in love. But now she could see it. The way his eyes never quite matched his smile. The way he angled himself slightly away from her, as if already preparing to leave. The way his hand on her waist looked less like affection and more like possession. Who was this man? And more terrifyingly, what was he planning to do with her identity? The next morning, Sarah woke up on the couch where she'd finally fallen asleep around dawn. For a brief, merciful moment, she forgot. Then memory crashed back in, and with it came a new emotion underneath the hurt and betrayal: anger. He had taken advantage of her trust, her love, her carefully built life, and she wasn't going to let him destroy her without a fight. She started with the basics, calling the Social Security Administration to report her card stolen, contacting the State Department about her passport, putting fraud alerts on her credit reports. Each call was a small act of reclaiming control, of building walls around what remained of her identity. Her employer was understanding but firm. Without her credentials, she'd have to take leave until the situation was resolved. Clients needed to be reassured that their data was secure. Sarah understood, but the financial implications terrified her. She had savings, but how long would they last if this dragged on? Monica helped her dig deeper into Michael's background. They started with social media, but his profiles had been minimal, she realized now. A Facebook account with few posts and fewer friends. A LinkedIn that listed his job but no connections from the company. They searched for his name online and found dozens of Michael Porters, but none that matched the man she'd married. It was as if he'd been a ghost all along. Sarah remembered the business card he'd given her when they first met. She'd kept it in her wallet, a small memento of that first conversation. She pulled it out now, staring at the company name printed in corporate blue. MedTech Solutions. She called the main number listed on the card. "I'm sorry," the receptionist said after Sarah asked for Michael Porter. "We don't have anyone by that name in our employee directory." Sarah's heart sank. "But I have his business card. He told me he worked there." There was a pause. "Ma'am, we've had issues in the past with people creating fake business cards with our company name. I'm very sorry, but the person you're looking for doesn't work here." The call ended, and Sarah sat in stunned silence. The business card was fake. The job was fake. How much of Michael James Porter was real at all? She decided to reach out to his family, even though their numbers seemed disconnected. She found a profile online for a woman with the same last name who'd been tagged in one of Michael's old photos. Sarah sent a message explaining who she was and asking if this person was related to Michael Porter. The response came 3 hours later and made everything worse. "I don't know who you are or who you married, but my family doesn't have anyone named Michael. That photo was stolen from my profile. I reported it to Facebook months ago. I'm sorry you're going through this, but the person you married isn't who he said he was." Sarah read the message 5 times, each word driving the truth deeper. Michael Porter wasn't his real name. His family at the wedding had been actors or accomplices. Everything had been an elaborate con. But why? What could he possibly gain from her documents that was worth this level of deception? She thought about her work, her access to healthcare data, her professional credentials. Could he use those to commit fraud, to access systems he shouldn't have access to? The possibilities made her sick. She contacted her company's security team, explaining everything. They took it seriously, immediately revoking her access and launching an internal investigation. No breaches had been detected, but they'd monitor closely. Sarah also hired a private investigator, draining a chunk of her savings to do it. The investigator, a former police detective named Robert Chen, listened to her story without judgment. "This is more common than you'd think," he said, which somehow made it worse. "Romance fraud, identity theft. Usually the victims don't realize until significant damage is done. You catching it this quickly might have saved you." He took all the information she had. Photos, the fake business card, details about the wedding, descriptions of Michael's supposed family. "I'll find out who he really is," Robert promised. "But I need you to prepare yourself. People who do this are professionals. He's probably done it before, and his real identity might be nothing like the man you thought you married." Sarah nodded, though the words felt surreal. She'd married a professional con artist. She'd fallen in love with a fiction. Days turned into weeks with no word from Michael and no breakthroughs in finding him. Sarah went through the motions of her life in a fog. She couldn't work. She couldn't sleep properly. Every time her phone rang, her heart jumped, hoping and dreading that it might be him. Monica practically moved in, refusing to let Sarah spiral alone. Together, they created a timeline of the relationship, looking for clues they'd missed. The ways he'd isolated her subtly from questioning him too deeply. The ways he'd gained access to her apartment, her files, her trust. The pattern was clear in retrospect, but at the time, blinded by affection, she'd seen none of it. What would you do if someone you loved turned out to be a complete stranger? How would you cope with the realization that your judgment had been so catastrophically wrong? The breakthrough came 5 weeks after the wedding. Robert Chen called Sarah, his voice tight with something between anger and sympathy. "I found him," he said, "and you need to sit down for this." Sarah sat on her couch, Monica beside her, phone on speaker. Robert explained that Michael Porter wasn't his real name. His real name was Marcus Pennington, and he had a criminal record in 3 states. He's done this before, Robert said. 4 times that I can confirm, possibly more. He targets successful women, often in healthcare or finance, gains their trust, marries them quickly, and steals their identities. Sarah felt the room spin. But why? What does he do with the documents? Robert's voice was grim. He sells them. Your professional credentials, your personal information, your access to systems, it's all valuable on the black market. Healthcare credentials especially. They can be used to file false insurance claims, access prescription databases, commit medical identity theft. Your documents were worth tens of thousands of dollars to the right buyer. The words didn't seem real. Her identity, her life's work, reduced to a commodity to be sold to criminals. There's more, Robert continued. The people at your wedding, his supposed family, they were actors. I tracked them down. They're part of his network, people he pays to play roles in his cons. They've done this for him before. The whole thing was choreographed. Monica gripped Sarah's hand as Robert kept talking. The worst part is, he's good at disappearing. By the time his victims realize what's happened, he's already moved on, changed his identity again, started targeting someone new. The police in multiple jurisdictions have been looking for him for years. So what do I do? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We keep looking, Robert said, and you keep protecting yourself. I've alerted federal authorities since this crosses state lines and involves identity theft. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. Even if we catch him, recovering from this will take time. The damage he's capable of doing with your credentials is significant. After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence. Monica tried to find comforting words but came up empty. There was nothing to say that could make this better. Marcus, Michael, whoever he was, hadn't just stolen her documents. He'd stolen her sense of safety, her ability to trust, her belief that people were fundamentally good. And he'd done it all while looking her in the eyes and promising forever. That night, Sarah received an email from an unknown address. Her heart stopped when she opened it. Sarah, I'm sorry it had to be this way. You seem like a good person, and for what it's worth, parts of it were real for me. But this is what I do. I needed what you could provide, and you made it easy. Don't take it personally. You'll recover. They always do. Good luck with your life. She read it 3 times, rage building with each word. Don't take it personally. He'd stolen her identity, her documents, potentially her entire career, and she wasn't supposed to take it personally? She forwarded the email to Robert and the police immediately. They tried to trace it, but of course it had been sent through encrypted networks, impossible to track. He was taunting her, secure in the knowledge that he'd gotten away with it. But that email, cold and dismissive as it was, gave Sarah something she desperately needed. Clarity. This wasn't her fault. She hadn't been stupid or naive. She'd been targeted by someone who made a living out of exploiting trust. And if he'd done this to 4 other women, if he was out there preparing to do it again, then she had a responsibility to stop him. Not just for herself, for all of them. 3 months after her wedding night, Sarah stood in a federal building in downtown Chicago, about to give testimony to a grand jury. Robert Chen had continued investigating, connecting Sarah's case with the other women Marcus had targeted. Together, they'd built a case strong enough to warrant federal charges: wire fraud, identity theft, criminal impersonation. The list went on. 2 of Marcus's accomplices, including the woman who'd played his sister at the wedding, had been arrested and agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. They'd given up his real location, a small town in Oregon, where he'd been living under yet another assumed name, already in the process of courting his next victim. Federal agents had arrested him 3 weeks ago. Sarah had cried when she got the call, not tears of joy, but of relief so overwhelming it felt like grief. It was over. He couldn't hurt anyone else. The courtroom was cold and formal, but Sarah's testimony was anything but. She told the jury everything: how they'd met, how he'd made her feel, how carefully he'd constructed his lies. She showed them the wedding photos, the fake business card, the timeline of manipulation. When she described waking up to an empty bed and stolen documents on what should have been the first day of her marriage, several jurors looked away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the pain. Marcus, appearing via video link from the detention center, showed no emotion. He looked older than Sarah remembered, or perhaps she was just seeing him clearly for the first time, without the filter of affection. When their eyes met through the screen, she felt nothing but exhausted relief. He had no power over her anymore. The trial would take months, Robert warned her, but the charges were serious, and with testimony from multiple victims and his accomplices turning on him, conviction was likely. Sarah focused on rebuilding. She'd gotten new documents, changed all her passwords and security questions, frozen her credit. Her company had allowed her to return to work once the investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing. The clients had been understanding, her reputation intact. Financially, she'd taken a hit, but she'd survive. She always did. Monica threw her a divorce party, even though the marriage had been annulled. They burned the wedding photos, drank too much wine, and laughed until they cried. It felt like an exorcism, releasing the ghost of who Sarah had been when she believed in Marcus. The other women Marcus had targeted reached out, forming an unexpected support network. They shared their stories, their strategies for recovery, their hard-won wisdom. Sarah learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days she felt strong and resilient, proud of how she'd fought back. Other days, she couldn't shake the feeling of having been fundamentally fooled. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma and betrayal. Together, they worked through the complicated emotions, the shame that wasn't hers to carry, the anger that was entirely justified, the grief for the future she'd imagined and would never have. Slowly, in inches and then in miles, Sarah began to feel like herself again. Not the same self she'd been before Marcus. That version of her was gone, replaced by someone warier but also stronger, someone who'd been tested and survived. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't really a wedding, Sarah stood in her apartment looking at the space she'd reclaimed. She'd redecorated, painting the walls a soft gray, replacing the bed, making it feel like hers again. Monica had helped, turning the process into an act of defiance rather than defeat. "You know what I learned?" Sarah said one evening as they hung new curtains. Monica looked at her, waiting. That loving someone doesn't make you weak or stupid, even when they betray that love. What he did says everything about him and nothing about me. I chose to trust. That's not a flaw. The flaw was his. Monica smiled, proud and a little teary. "Look at you, getting all wise and philosophical." Sarah laughed. "Don't worry, I still have days where I want to scream, but I'm getting there." The lesson Sarah carried forward wasn't about never trusting again. It was about trusting herself, about listening to those quiet voices of concern, about knowing that choosing to be open to love was still worth the risk, as long as she remained anchored in her own worth. Marcus had taken a lot from her, but he hadn't taken everything. She was still standing, still fighting, still building the life she deserved. And that, she realized, was the greatest revenge of all. When someone betrays you that deeply, they expect you to break. They count on it. But Sarah refused to give him that satisfaction. She would recover, thrive, and eventually, when she was ready, she would trust again. Because the alternative, living in fear, closing herself off, letting his actions define her future, would mean he'd won. And Sarah Mitchell was not someone who let others write her ending. She was the author of her own life. And this chapter, painful as it was, would not be the last. Sometimes the worst betrayals reveal the strongest truths about who we really are. What would you have done in Sarah's place? Could you have seen the signs before it was too late? How would you rebuild your life after someone you loved stole not just your documents, but your sense of safety and trust? These are the questions that haunt not just Sarah, but the thousands of people who fall victim to romance fraud every year. This story is based on real cases, real pain, real survivors who found the strength to fight back. If you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you hear the next one. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the stories that will shock you, inspire you, and leave you thinking long after the screen goes dark. And remember, loving someone should never cost you everything. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never be afraid to question when something feels off. Your instincts exist for a reason. Thank you for watching.